Well, good morning. Welcome to Lakeshore again. We're so glad that you are with us today, and I'm glad to be here. Man, what a good week. I know we just mentioned Love Week, but for me, too, to be able to see that this week, to see our church get out in the community and love on our community in the way that you did, with the style that you did, with the excellence that you did, you just got to know that that makes us so proud. So I come this morning so grateful. I'm sitting here just listening to the music. I'm so grateful for you, grateful for our church, and I hope you are as well, because God's truly doing some really cool stuff here, right? Or is it just me? Yeah, he really is. I'm grateful for the music team and just setting this whole thing up, and the songs that were picked today, and the lyrics in that. It's going to, at least for me, it really resonates really deeply in there. And I come today very grateful for you, and you have to know this, that for us as pastors, a lot of times we're pouring out. We try to come up with a message, whatever we give that, or we come up with a plan for a program that we think will help people spiritually. We put that out there, and we put out a lot. But sometimes what you don't realize is how much you put back into us as leaders, and how much you pour into us. And I have to be honest, I've gone through the last few months a period where maybe I've asked some questions that you have asked as well, and I want to encourage you with that. You're not alone in asking some of these pesky, difficult questions, but in that process of asking those questions, God has used you in a big way in my faith. God has used you in my faith, where I've seen some of you go through some extremely difficult times that I know you would never wish on anybody else, and yet I've walked with you through them, and I've seen God work through you, and I've seen you hold on to your faith through those, and I got to tell you, that does something powerful for my faith. Because I have to be honest again, I leave here some days, and I've literally walked out of my office, walked to my car, and I'm looking up into the sky, where the path where the FedEx plane, flies out. It's always there. And I look out, and sometimes I just look up to heaven, and I shake my head. I say, God, what in the world are you doing? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we're aware of God's presence. We know He's there, but let's be honest. Sometimes it seems like He's somewhat absent, right? Or is it just me? He seems like He's somewhat absent, that maybe he just called in sick on this particular day, or he went on a trip, or he went to the cabin, right, because it's summertime, and he just stayed a little long there, or maybe he fell asleep, and we're just waiting for him in our lives to wake up. See, I believe He's a God of justice, but I see injustice everywhere. I believe He's a God who hates seeing His people hurt, but I get to interact with hurting people all the time. And sometimes I wonder where God is. I mean, even it wasn't just a few days ago where something sick happened, right? Where a man was in a body of water drowning, right? And there were people on the shore that could have helped. They didn't call 911, though. They pulled out their stinking cell phones and filmed it and put it on the internet for everybody to see while he died. I mean, doesn't something like that, if you're just a thinking intellectual person, don't you look at that and you say, okay, we talk about God's presence, He's really there, He's always there, no matter what we're going through, ups and downs in life, whatever, yada, 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 but where was He then? I mean, wouldn't that have at least caused him to get out of his easy chair and at least look? I've had doubts, guys. If you doubt the presence of God, you're not alone. Pastors doubt it too. We just don't often say it. We do. And your faith through the incredibly difficult times has made a profound impact on my life. The other day, just preparing for this, I got my whiteboard and I just started writing down the names of many of you. 20-some, 30-some people in the last year who I've been able to sit down face-to-face with you, or I've seen kind of from a distance what you've been going through. And I've been and these are all names of people in our church, of people who never stopped trusting God, who never stopped believing in God, never stopped attending your small group and leaning on other people through it, that you leaned into God and into His presence through the most difficult time you've ever gone through in your life. And so I want to come today, I think I need to just come and just say thank you for what you've done in my heart as I've been able to see you with that. Here's really the thing that I'm trying to start with today, and what I'm trying to get through in this whole message is simply this fact, and it's in your notes. God encourages us through the ups and downs of life. God encourages us through the ups and downs of life when we realize that we're never actually alone. He encourages us when we get to a place that somehow we can say and believe with everything inside of us that we're not alone. Even when it's a horribly difficult time, when it seems like God has to be absent, when we get to a place where by faith we believe that he's still there, that encourages us and encourages other people who see that. Psalm 139, David is writing this incredible psalm. It's one that's often quoted, but he says this in verses 7 to 8. He says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" And then he pulls out some polar opposites here. He says, "If I go up to the heavens," so beyond the earth's atmosphere to wherever it is that God is, if I go up to the heavens, you're there. "And if I make my bed in the depths," the bottom level floor of the ocean, you're there as well. And everywhere in between. God is everywhere. He is everywhere present. This is a truth that I was taught as a young boy, and I still believe it today, though I've gone through seasons where I've doubted that, and I've questioned it, and I've wondered it. And so what I want to do today is I want to give you 2 strategies to help you lean into God's presence, 2 strategies that have helped me to lean into God's presence, especially in those moments where I just wonder where he really is. I want to give a quick disclaimer here. These 2 points are not original to me. There's a songwriter who recently wrote a song. His name is Torrin Wells, and it's a fantastic song. It's really had a big impact in my heart. But I saw him kind of do a video where he was telling the story behind that song, and he shared a quote, and that quote is literally these 2 points. So if he's watching or if he's listening, I totally stole your sermon. Thank you. I said, that'll preach. So we're going to preach that today. Let me give you the context for what we're talking about here in this message as I get to these 2 strategies. We're going to be looking at one story in the Old Testament. It's a fairly common story. You've probably heard it if you've been around church for any length of time. But it involves the prophet named Elijah. And it's the famous situation that occurred on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to 1 Kings 18. We'll be looking at some of the verses in your notes, but there'll be a lot more that I'm going to reference and read throughout. So if you have your Bible, you can go ahead and pull them out, and you'll see them. Let me give some quick context for where we are and where this story lands in biblical history. This is during the divided kingdom for the nation of Israel. So the nation of Israel was originally a slave nation. They grew up as slaves in Egypt. Remember that? Remember the 10 plagues and God rescuing with a mighty show of force, a spectacular hand showing power. He brought them out of Egypt into the wilderness, and they wandered in the wilderness. It wasn't supposed to be a long time, but it turned out being a very long time, 40 years in the wilderness. That first generation died off. Nobody left from that into the land except Joshua and Caleb. So Joshua leads the people, this new generation, the kids of the people who came out of Egypt. He leads their kids into the promised land, and they go into the promised land. They go through a lot of battles and conquests to possess the land. They possess the land, and then the judges occur. It's a confusing time. It's a messed up time. And all the Israelites come around, they say, we want a king around us. We want a king over us, like all the cool kids around us, all the cool nations around us. They have a king, we want a king. So they get a king, even though God knows it's not going to turn out well for them as a result. But he gives them what they want. So Saul is the king, and then David is the king, and Solomon. And a few generations later, there's a big civil war that occurs, and 10 of the tribes from the northern part of the country form one nation, as it were, and then the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they become Judah. We're going to be looking today specifically at one of the kings of the northern kingdom, King Ahab, and he was definitely a complex individual. The prophet, again, is the prophet Elijah, and you got to understand there's a unique relationship between prophets and kings in the Old Testament that's really important to understand. The prophet's job was really nothing more than what the speakers are here doing in our auditorium that you can hear. Their prophet's job was simply to hear from what God was saying and to relay exactly what was being said to the audience that God told them to say it to. So a lot of times a prophet would stand up in front of the people of Israel or the people of Judah, and they would stand up and they would say something that God wanted them to say exactly how he wanted to say it. But sometimes God would ask this prophet to go directly to the king and talk to a king and let that be the audience. And that's the case here with Elijah. So God raises up Elijah to give a message to Ahab. And Ahab was not a good king. He was not a dude that was leading the people in any way close to God. In fact, he and his lovely wife Jezebel, which by the way, you probably don't, anybody know anybody who's named Jezebel? That's not one that's typically picked by parents because of her track record. She was a really evil person. But anyways, they were linked up, and together they brought evil into the land. There's idol worship all over the place, largely because of them. They introduced it in many ways. And so Elijah had some messages from God for Ahab. And one day, when we first hear about Elijah, he gets on the scene. He somehow gets in front of King Ahab, and he says to King Ahab, "Hey, King Ahab, I want to let you know, it's not going to be raining for a few years, and it's not going to start raining until I tell it to. Goodbye." And then he just walks off the scene. Now, to us, in our culture, we would say, sounds kind of good. That's awesome. We got a lot of bottled water, and we can be on the beach. It's great. We don't really like rain here. But in this culture, that's a death sentence, okay? That means drought. That means famine. And so when Ahab heard this, I think probably at first he was like, he probably had interacted with a lot of crazy people in his day, and he's like, well, that's just one more, whatever, walked away. Until 3 years later, when there's still no rain. And people are dying, and animals are dying, and there's a huge drought in the land, and everybody's desperate, and they're hurting. And so Ahab then goes on a quest to find this man. And he's sending his people out, and he's searching everywhere, high and low, for this guy. He says, if you find him, you don't spare him, you kill him. I just want him dead. So I want the rain to come back. It's almost like I think of Frozen, when Anna leaves Arendelle to look for Elsa, and so I'm going to bring back summer. That sort of thing, right? Got it. All right, so anyways, he's going out looking for him. Finally, he finds him, right? He finds Elijah. And he sees him off in the distance. He can recognize somehow that it's him. He yells out to him. He says, "Hey, Elijah, you troubler of Israel." And Elijah comes back to him without any hesitation. He says, "Me? I'm not the troubler of Israel. You're the troubler of Israel." And when two men go back and forth like that, it's never going to end well. In fact, you might as well just set up a boxing ring or make a UFC match or something right there, because it's just going to go back and forth. And that's kind of what happens in an ancient antiquities kind of way here. Elijah says to him, let's settle this. Let's settle the score. Let's figure out who's the real God in Israel, because you've led the people astray after all these false gods. We're going to figure it out. Bring your people on a mountain called Mount Carmel, and we'll have a showdown. And so that's exactly what happens. Ahab gets 450 prophets of Baal, which is the predominant false god that people would be worshiping in that land, and it infiltrated into the people of Israel. 450 prophets of Baal, and then Jezebel had kind of her own harem of prophets as well, of about 400 prophets of Asherah, which is kind of like the female version of Baal. So you had 850 prophets, false prophets up on this mountain, and Elijah. 1 to 850, okay? So it's not really stacked in Elijah's favor here. Not only that, but word was spread throughout the whole land, so you've got a whole mountain full of spectators, of people from the land really trying to figure out what's going to happen, and they're not all very happy with Elijah either, because there's been no rain, supposedly because of what Elijah said. So Elijah then stands up in front of the people, and he says this. He gives this challenge. He says, he asks this question, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? How long are you going to flip-flop between two gods? And sometimes I think God asks us that question too. He asks us, especially when we go through hard times in our life, through droughts and through famines in our lives, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? Are you trusting me or not? So he just asks that question, and there's no response. It's pretty silent. So Elijah says, let's do it this way. Why don't you set up an altar? And I'll set up an altar as well. And this altar, and we're going to get two animals, and we're going to kill both animals, and we're going to cut them up. We're going to put them on the altar. And you prophets of Baal and Asherah, you guys, you cut that, that animal up, and you pray to your God to send fire and to consume that altar. And if he does, we will follow him. I will do the same. Elijah's saying, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to cut up an animal, put him on here, and I'm going to pray to my God. And whichever God responds with fire, that's the one who will be worthy of our praise and our following. That sound good? Makes sense? Again, 850 to 1. The odds are certainly stacked in the favor. Even the location of this challenge, all of it really was stacked in the favor of these false prophets. So here's what happens. It gets really interesting. Hold on. I'm so excited that you got to read your Bible because this is all in there. It's so fun. The prophets of Baal, all morning they cried out to Baal, all morning long, from sun up all the way through. They're crying out, they're praying, they're on their knees, any posture they can come up with to get his attention to do this, nothing happens. They start doing what anybody in church does when it gets boring. They start dancing, right? So they're just dancing around, right? So they're dancing and they're trying to get his attention that way. I mean, surely that would get his attention. Nothing happened. And Elijah's just sitting over there on the side, just kind of watching it all silently. Finally, lunchtime comes around and nothing's happening. He can't be quiet anymore. So he starts asking some taunting questions. He says, hey, maybe he's, I don't know, on a trip or something. Maybe you got to shout a little bit louder. I mean, surely he's a God, right? I mean, you have such confidence in this. Surely he's a God. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or he's busy, or he's traveling. Maybe he's asleep and needs to just be woken up. If you sense the sarcasm here, it's exactly what it is, okay? Elijah is just sarcastically just taunting at him. When he says, interesting fun fact here I found this week, when he says that maybe he's busy, that's a very interesting Hebrew word. It actually means literally that maybe he's gone aside, which would be a way of saying maybe he's relieving himself. So Elijah's literally sitting there saying, maybe he's in the bathroom. You just got to wait a little bit longer, but he's coming. Or he's going to show up. Just keep going. So he keeps going. They keep doing this through the afternoon, into the evening, still nothing. They shouted louder. They began cutting themselves. It says they took knives and slashed themselves. The common thought of the day was that the gods would respond to blood. If they saw blood, they would be more likely to respond. And they get into the evening, nothing. Nothing. So finally, Elijah steps forward and he says, all right, sit down. My turn. And all he does is something that you wouldn't really expect, something that I certainly wouldn't have expected if I were doing this. I wouldn't have done it if I was him. His faith is amazing to me. He builds a trench around his altar. He builds a trench, a deep trench. And he takes 4 jugs of water, and he has the 4 jugs of water dumped over the animal and over the wood and over the altar. 4 large jugs. Then he says, not enough. Do it again. So they do it again. And then they do it again. So what is that? There's a lot of math here today. 12, right? 12 jugs. 12 big jugs of water. It actually, the text says it fills up the trench. This thing is soaking wet. Now, I'm not a Boy Scout. My parents tried to get me to be one. They really tried hard. I couldn't do the knots. We had like this Christian version of Boy Scouts in our church growing up. It wasn't Boy Scouts. It was kind of like something like that. But I especially that thing where you're supposed to start the fire with one match, could never do that. I'm not a Boy Scout, but I know that this is probably not the way to start a fire. Just a thought. And yet, this is what God told him to do. So it's completely soaking wet. The text says that Elijah stepped forward and he prayed. In your notes, you can look at this in 1 Kings 18, 36 to 37. The time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I'm your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you're turning their hearts back again. Here's what Elijah's doing. He's trying to make it so obvious of what God's about to do and who the one true God is. You get that? Do you see the pronouns? He said, you are God. I'm your servant, your command. You are turning their hearts back again. And that brings us to the first strategy in your notes. On the mountaintops of life, when you're on the mountaintops of life, you're about to be in a very successful spot or a very successful life. You're about to have a victory in your life. On the mountaintops of life, we need to learn to bow low. We need to learn to bow low. We need to learn who to give the praise to. We need to get out of the way so that people can clearly see that it was God that set us there, that it was God that did that, not us. And Elijah is extremely intentional about this. He did exactly that. The story goes that at that very moment, immediately after Elijah prayed, guess what happens? There wasn't a delay. There wasn't waiting. There was no need for taunting. Fire came down. It consumed the altar. The text says it licked up the water that was in the trench. That cannot be explained humanly, only supernaturally. And the one true God got the praise for that. And the people began to follow, and they were amazed. In fact, look at the response in verse 39 in your notes. It says, when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate. They fell down. They bowed low, and they cried, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is. In other words, He's the one true God. There is no Baal. He's not gone on vacation. He doesn't exist. And they understood that. It's really important to notice, again, who gets the credit here. Elijah made no moves to claim the victory for himself. He made no moves for the glory here. He gave it all to God. I wonder if you and I, once we go through the good times in life, the successful times in life, how easy is it for us to get the glory for that? To say, yeah, I mean, God certainly did that and stuff, but I worked hard. Yeah, or I put my time in. I did that thing, or I didn't give up when I really wanted to, and we keep using I, when really God's the one that did it all. That He gave us the power and the ability to get to where we were. He's the one who placed us in that spot. He's the one who picked us up and put us on the mountain, so He ought to get the glory and the praise. Bishop Dave's message a couple weeks ago was all on that whole thing. It was such a good one. He really expounds on that, and it was really encouraging. God encourages through the ups and downs of life when we realize we're never actually alone. If you're on the mountaintop of life, don't think that you're alone. Don't think that you got there alone on your own. When you land that good job, when you get the promotion, when you got the girl or you got the guy, you have a child and you say, this was our doing. It's not. God opens wombs, God closes wombs, and we're not even able to explain scientifically sometimes how that happens. You got the nice car, you got the nice house, your kid behaves well, he actually got a good report card. Like God gets the glory for that. Anything that moves your status up in the eyes of people, you ought to move people's eyes up to God, right? Our knee-jerk reaction can be to push God out of these conversations. Our natural gravitation because of sin, because of ego, is to take the glory for ourselves. But God's saying, not so fast. I didn't leave you. I've been with you the whole time. Here's another thing I've learned too. A mountaintop's actually a very dangerous place to be when you're alone. It's actually physically, literally, it's a very dangerous place to be when you're very vulnerable, you're very exposed. You want to be around other people that can help you. It's why the problems with drugs is not just something that's in the city, it's in the suburbs as well. You got CEOs and heads of companies, very successful businessmen who struggle with drugs just as much. Why? Why is that? Because it's kind of lonely at the top, isn't it? And what you do to get up to that top, if you're doing it all on your own, you gotta sustain that level as well. How you sustain that stress when it's really, in your mind, you that did it? It's God that did it. So don't take the glory for it. Give Him the praise. He never left you. You're not alone. He's with you. But the same is true not just on the mountaintops of life, but sometimes even more difficult to see. It's in the valleys of life. God is present there as well. Again, He's in the heavens and He's in the depths below and everything in between. God's presence is in the valleys as well. And so your second strategy today, what I want to communicate, the last one is this. In the valleys of life, we need to learn to stand tall. In the valleys of life, we need to learn to stand tall. See, that's why I stole this outline, because that's so good. I didn't make that up myself. And on the mountains, we have to bow low. and give God the praise. And in the valleys, when all we want to do is crumble into nothing, we need to stand tall, be confident, trust that God never left us, trust that he will never leave us in the future, that we're not going to give in to fear, and we're going to trust him. We're going to be confident. I want you to see what happens here. After this mountaintop high on Mount Carmel, Elijah has all the prophets of Baal. He has them killed and slaughtered. There, it's if you can just imagine, it's pretty gruesome. He sends to Ahab, go back home. My message here is done. And he leaves. Ahab goes back to his home. Jezebel wasn't with him. His wife Jezebel wasn't with him on this, so he tells her what had happened. And this is a pattern you'll see with Ahab. He's kind of like the child that goes home and tells mom. So he goes home and tells Jezebel, his wife, what happened, and she's mad. I mean, this was her harem of prophets that this Elijah just slaughtered. So she gets a messenger. She sends this messenger to Elijah, and here's the message. Elijah, over my dead body, she says, you did what? In 24 hours, I'm going to use everything at my disposal, all powers that I can possibly muster up to make sure you're dead. You've got 24 hours to live. You might want to run. He sends this message to Elijah, and for some reason, and I think we all can identify with this, but for some reason, very quickly, this just takes the wind out of Elijah's sails. He had an amazing moment just hours before this, seeing the power of God displayed, right? And the words of a woman struck him to his core. I think we all can identify with that. We all have moments where it maybe doesn't make sense rationally, but for whatever reason, it just, the words just hit you at that perfect insecurity, or it just cuts you right down at that place where you're most vulnerable. And for whatever reason, for Elijah, he was. It's kind of like when you go to your small group, right? And you have something heavy on your heart, just something really just that hurts. You are hurting, and you get to your small group, and everyone's going around, and you're taking prayer requests, right? Or you're just sharing life updates, and you get to the person like next to you, and you're about to share. You're trying to muster up the courage of what to say and how to even frame this, even how to even share it. And they're like, yeah, could you pray for me? I lost my keys. You're like, I hate you. You just get to those places where you're like, is that really? I mean, I got a story. I got to tell you, like, here's what happened for me. You know what I mean? And this is where Elijah is. He is just cut to the core. Look at what he does here in verses 3-4 in your notes. It says this. We get some insight into his head. Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. So he was afraid. That's the first. If you're taking notes, you can just write. There's three things here. He was afraid, and so he ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. It's about 15 miles further. So not only is he afraid, but he's alone. He's afraid and he's alone. He came to a broom tree. He sat down under it for some shade, and he prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than any of my ancestors. So not only is he afraid and alone, but now he's in despair. He sees hopelessness in his life and around him. I want you to know that anxiety and depression is not something new for us today, right? Can you see that? Can you be encouraged by that? Anxiety and depression, you can see he's got a severe bout with it right now. It's very common for all of us. And if you're struggling with at times in your life feeling afraid, and you're not even sure why, but you're just afraid, everything inside you wants to kind of isolate yourself, right? You want to just pull away from the people that can actually help you the most. And if you're not careful, you're going to get to a place where you're in despair. You're not even sure if it makes sense to live anymore. And that's where Elijah was. This is not a small thing. He's not just kind of having a bad day. He's on the brink of suicide. And Elijah is about to be reminded, though, in this valley moment, that God is still with him, even now. You can keep reading the story. He goes on further down a journey, about 40 days and 40 nights further. He just continues to run. He's running for his life. He's motivated here. He's afraid. He thinks that he's going to die. He doesn't want to die, so he's running for his life. 40 days and 40 nights. And finally, he gets to a very historic, very key location in Israel's history. He gets to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. Now, where have you heard of Mount Sinai before? This is important. Where have you heard of Mount Sinai before? Moses, right? And the Ten Commandments. This was the mountain of God. This is the mountain where the people, when they're coming out of Egypt, they stood at this mountain, and Moses went up. And Moses went up on this mountain, and he got the Ten Commandments. And while he was getting the Ten Commandments, crazy things were happening all around the people to the point that they were afraid. They didn't even want to approach God in that moment. The text is very clear that there was a wind that was crazy out of this world, all around, scary wind, like windstorm times 10 kind of wind. There was an earthquake. The earth was trembling and shaking. There was fire everywhere. This was on that mountain when Moses was getting the Ten Commandments. That was all happening. And Elijah comes to this, ironically, this same mountain. And God gives a message to Elijah when he's on this mountain. He says this in your notes, verses 11 here. Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord's about to pass by. So Elijah probably goes out, stands there. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. That wasn't the first time that's happened here. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. It's not the first time that's happened here. God was in that before, but not this time. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, though, maybe we're thinking sometime a little bit later, probably Elijah goes back into the cave, but he hears something. He hears the Lord pass by in a gentle whisper. It says, when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face. He went back out of the cave and stood at the mouth of the cave. That for some reason, God wasn't showing up in this moment in the spectacular. God wasn't showing up in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, though he's done that many times in his past, though he did that before at this very location on Mount Sinai, though he did that on the mountain that Elijah was just on, Mount Carmel, though God sometimes shows up in the mountaintop experiences in the spectacular, I think what's happening here is that God had a different message for Elijah. That sometimes God shows up not just in the spectacular, but God sometimes shows up in the mundane and the everyday. The moments when you're discouraged, that God is just as present there as well. Those moments when you're in a hospital room, right? And you're afraid and you're scared, and the doctor just came in and said what the doctor said, and you are just brought down to the core. And you don't even know what direction is up at that moment. In that moment, you don't want the spectacular. You don't want the fire and the wind and the earthquake. You want God to speak to you in a gentle voice. You want him to, in a hushed tone, speak to your heart what you need to hear in that moment. And that's what God does for Elijah here. And it's a message and a lesson I think we all need to learn as well, that God is on the mountaintops of life. He is in the successes, but he's also just as much and just as present in the hard times, in the valleys, in the moments when nothing makes sense. He's there. He hasn't left you. What's really interesting to me here is, and this will mess with your theology some, I hope that it does. Listen to what God says. He says this. The Lord said to Elijah after he spoke to him in this still small voice, this gentle whisper. He says, go back the way you came. Go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And then he says this. Listen to this. Read between the lines here. Anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. You know what God doesn't say here? He doesn't say, Elijah, it's going to be okay. God is present in this moment, but he looks at Elijah and he says, get your succession plan going. He doesn't say that Jezebel is going to go ahead and for sure kill him, but he doesn't say he's going to be living for 10 more years either. He says, get the plan going. And I am with you and I am present with you through it, but get it going. You know, sometimes we want to believe in a God who will answer our prayers the way we're praying them, but sometimes God doesn't do that. We want to believe in a God and follow a God who always has our best interest in mind as we define our best interests, but doesn't always do that. We want to believe and we want to pray that God will deliver us from whatever sickness that is, whatever hurt that is, and we can pray, and we should pray. We should continue to pray and not give up. We should believe that he can do that, but if he doesn't, he's still good. He's still worthy of our praise, and he's still present in that pain. See, here's what I've learned, that God is a God of the mountaintops and a God of the valley moments. He's a God of the hills and a God of the valleys. He's the God who, on Mount Carmel, consumed the sacrifice with fire. But he's also the God who allowed Elijah to suffer severe anxiety and depression right up to the point of wanting to kill himself. He's the God of the hills and the valleys. He caused Joseph, if you look back in history, he caused Joseph to prosper in Egypt and come up with a plan that saved literally thousands of people. But he first allowed Joseph to be sold into slavery. He was the God of the valleys who allowed Joseph to be wrongfully incarcerated for years before exonerated. He's the God of the hills and the valleys. He's the God who delivered Daniel from harm when he was thrown in a cage full of lions. And we get so excited about that, right? We're so excited about the fact that Daniel came out without a tooth mark on him. But you got to understand, he's also the God who first allowed his faith to be unjustly singled out and outlawed to begin with. He's the same God who allowed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be bound up and thrown into fire, deadly fire, and held in that fire, but come out without a burn mark on them and survived it. Yes, he's that God, but he's also the God of the valleys. He's the God who first allowed those same young men to be ripped apart from their families and their hometowns and exiled in a foreign country. He's the same God. He's the same God who miraculously broke Paul and Silas out of prison with an earthquake. The church was praying and God delivered them out of the prison. But he's also the same God who allowed John the Baptist to be beheaded when he was in prison. And John the Baptist never came back to life. When Jesus was here on the earth, he is the same God. He's fully God and fully man. He's the same God who had a single word. He kept the centurion's son alive when the centurion had the faith to believe that, yes, the God of the hills. But he's also the God of the valleys. He's the God of the valleys who he stayed back 3 days too long when Lazarus was sick. And if Jesus had only come, he would not have died. Jesus let that happen. He's the God who turned water into wine. He's the God of the hills and the valleys. He's the God who turned water into wine. He told the lame to walk, the sick to be healed. He's the God who calmed the storms, walked on water, and raised the dead. But he's also the God who was unjustly accused, who was betrayed for a pile of money, who was abandoned by all his friends and crucified in the most excruciating way possible, all at the sanctioned hands of the state. He's the God of the hills and the God of the valleys. He's present at every point in between. Everywhere in between. He's the God who's present in the ups and the downs of life, and we're never, ever alone. The presence of evil and the presence of pain in our lives doesn't mean that God's not there. It just means that perhaps our expectations of him have been off. And you are never alone.